Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Danylo Lubkivsky, and I'm happy to welcome you on behalf of the Kyiv Security Forum. Today, we will discuss the results of what they call the controversial NATO summit in Vilnius, which attracted a lot of international attention around the globe. The key question was Ukraine. NATO leaders have declared to extend an invitation to Ukraine to join the alliance when allies agree and conditions are met. This is the language of the document. And this language means that Kyiv's future is in NATO, but without a real timeline. Yesterday, President Zelensky of Ukraine assumed that there is no readiness neither to invite Ukraine to NATO, nor to make it a member of the alliance. For Russia, I quote, "This means their motivation to continue its terror," he concluded. On another side, today, the G7 countries have agreed a joint framework for providing long-term security guarantees to Ukraine. The commitments will include supplies of modern military equipment across land, air, and sea domains. In exchange, Kyiv would commit to reforms, including of the judiciary and civilian control of the military. During these 2 days, NATO also discussed weapons provision to Kyiv. France would send its long-range missiles. Germany has offered a large 700 million euros package of weapons. The defense ministers of Denmark and the Netherlands announced a coalition of 11 Western nations to train the Ukrainian pilots for F-16. Altogether, the Financial Times reports and sums up that Ukraine's Western allies have shelled out more than 160 billion United States dollars in military and financial support since the full-fledged Russia's invasion against Ukraine. So this is generally a picture of what we saw in Vilnius. Now I wish to introduce our distinguished speakers with whom we will discuss the results of Vilnius NATO Summit. I'm happy to see Ambassador John Herbst, who is in Vilnius now. John is director of the Eurasia Center of the Atlantic Council and former United States Ambassador to Ukraine. Thank you, John, for joining us. Thank you. I'm happy to introduce our good friend, Ambassador Kurt Volker, former United States Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations and former United States Ambassador to NATO. Thank you, Kurt, for being with us. I'm glad to welcome here Andrius Kubilius, who is in Strasbourg today, the member of the Kyiv Security Forum Security Council and former Prime Minister of Lithuania, and now a member of the European Parliament. Andrius is a strong and great true friend of Ukraine. I'm really happy that you are with us, Mr. Prime Minister. And Arseniy Yatsenyuk, the chairman of the Kyiv Security Forum and former Prime Minister of Ukraine. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining this discussion and for your readiness to discuss and to analyze, to conclude, to wrap up what was decided in Vilnius. And I will immediately start with my questions to Ambassador Kurt Volker. Kurt, honestly speaking, the decision in Vilnius raised a lot of criticism, disappointment, and frustration in Ukraine. Many believed that NATO would announce a formal invitation to Ukraine. And it almost didn't happen. I would put it this way. So how would you assess the results of NATO summit in Vilnius? You're welcome.
Right. Well, first off, concerning expectations, no one should have thought that NATO would issue an invitation to join, that NATO would issue an invitation for Ukraine to join immediately. It was always a question of, is NATO sending the right signal to Putin about the perspective that Ukraine is truly going to become a member of NATO as soon as that's practical? And sending that signal so that his expectations are set about the war, about the future of European security, about NATO's determination, and about Ukraine's place in a unified Europe. And unfortunately, I think that signal was not sent. I think it was The language is arguably about the same as Bucharest. There are a few improvements. The requirement for a map, membership action plan, which had become an obstacle. People said the next step is the map and no, you can't have it. So they took that away. That's positive. Just like Finland and Sweden, Ukraine does not require a map. Also, they took a few steps to help Ukraine integrate a little bit more on a practical level with NATO, such as upgrading the commission to a NATO-Ukraine Council, working on interoperability and so forth. But apart from that, the political messaging out of Vilnius was actually about the same, saying, yes, Ukraine's place is in NATO in the future, but no process, no timeline, and no conviction, no real sincerity of the commitment to that coming out of Vilnius. And given the changed circumstances over the past year, where all illusions about any possibility of living with a normal Russia are shattered because of Russia's aggression, I think that repeating that kind of vague statement actually does damage. And I think in the context of Russia's war, it is an encouragement to Putin, keep up fighting as long as he can. We should have tried to do the opposite. We should have tried to get Putin to recognize that his quest to rebuild the Russian Empire is never going to succeed. And instead, I think we've now given him some encouragement.
Thank you, Kurt. And now I turn to Ambassador John Herbst. John, I believe that you followed closely the developments in Vilnius and how this decision-making process has been conducted. So, what's your assessment? How do you feel about the results? And by the way, many think that NATO, I mean, even taking into account what Ambassador Volker said, NATO could have done more. A lot of people, almost everyone, puts finger on President Biden and Germany in this sense. So how would you explain this, what people call some kind of strategic hesitation, if there is one? You're welcome.
All right. I agree with everything Kurt said. I can add some detail and hopes based upon developments for a better outcome at the next NATO summit. This was a failed opportunity. The communique was quite weak. It could and should have been stronger. And it was quite weak because principally the staunch opposition to a stronger communique from the White House, but also in league with the Chancellery in Berlin. We've known for months that the approach by the White House was going to be soft. And so a large number of NATO members were urging Washington to be stronger. And Washington found out, to its unhappy surprise, when the foreign ministers met to prepare for this summit a month or so ago in Scandinavia, that a substantial number of NATO allies wanted something more than Washington was willing to provide. The result of that was literally weeks of hard-fought talks involving the Baltic states, Poland, the Czech Republic, and to a lesser extent, but also the Brits, the French, who've been surprisingly strong. And as a result, the final summit language, while weak, is stronger than it would have been. The drama in Vilnius was heightened by Zelensky's sharp tweet criticizing the communique. That tweet, while I would say it was a bit strident, reflected legitimate concerns that he and all Ukrainians have, but also that many East European members of NATO, and not just East European members of NATO, have. The fact that this surprised the White House is surprising and maybe not quite honest, because Zelensky had said for weeks he was not going to go if he got very thin results, and that communique represents thin results. Nonetheless, the tweet embarrassed the administration. And of course, the tweet came before the communique was resolved, because the East Europeans, with a few others, were still fighting behind the scenes for stronger language. Again, the final result, disappointing, not surprising, but also somewhat better than it would have been if you didn't have strong opposition from a relatively united group of NATO members. That number is at least 8. The 3 Baltic states, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, and Czechia, with some sympathy from Denmark, even Holland, Paris, London. And I believe that this group is not going to disappear. I think they will be working hard for a much better outcome at the Washington summit next year. And the fact that they work together, despite some serious pressure from Washington, is a sign that their interests and concerns will need to be given fuller account in Washington. But I would add, and I think Kurt, actually I won't speak for Kurt, but many agree in Washington, Americans agree, that in fact, the East Europeans are right on this and the White House is wrong.
Mm-hmm. This is interesting, and we will get back on this. But before that, let me ask Prime Minister Kubilius for yet another question. But before I do this, Mr. Prime Minister, on behalf of the Kyiv Security Forum, on behalf of many of my friends and colleagues, our team, I would like to express our deepest gratitude to Lithuania and the Lithuanian nation for such a tremendous support of what we saw in Vilnius. I mean, this is heartbreaking. You know, it means a lot for us, for all Ukrainians. And my good friends who reported from Vilnius, they noticed how strong and sincere was the support of your government, but of ordinary people, and we highly appreciate this. So please receive this gratitude from Kyiv. I want you to know that how highly we appreciate it. And now I would like to ask you and to invite you to share your opinion. What do you think about the results? Are you satisfied, or what kind of opinion do you have?
Well, first of all, thanks a lot, Danylo, for all those words, nice words about Lithuania. Support Ukraine. I'm envying that I was not, in Vilnius on those days. We have our last plenary session here in Strasbourg. But I would like to express, first of all, our gratitude to Ukraine, for your fight, not just for your, freedom and your sovereignty, but for the freedom of all European continent. And that's why really, I agree with all of what was said by John and Kurt. Of course, we were Lithuanians, we were expecting stronger language on Ukrainian future membership in NATO. And I just put on my Facebook very simple comparison with very clear statement that unfortunately Vilnius is not so far away from Bucharest. And and I will use simply an opportunity to quote 2 sentences from Bucharest statement 2008, and then statement from yesterday communique. So Bucharest, the sentences on Ukraine. NATO welcomes Ukraine's and Georgia's Euro-Atlantic aspirations for membership in NATO. We agreed today that these countries will become members of NATO. That was said in 2008. Now, yesterday in Vilnius, we fully support Ukraine's right to choose its own security arrangements. Ukraine's future is in NATO. We will be in a position to extend an invitation to Ukraine to join the alliance when allies agree and conditions are met. So really, it's quite difficult to to see what is the difference, and definitely to say that NATO will be in position to extend an invitation when allies will agree. This is simply from from rules of NATO, from procedural rules of NATO, that you need to have a consensus. So really, language is in some way weak, and of course the question is why, and especially that it looked like before the summit that there is quite a clear agreement that what we're talking not about, and we need to talk in Vilnius summit, not about real membership of Ukraine in NATO when it will happen. Everybody agreed, and Zelensky was repeating that of course to expect membership during the war, when the war is going on, is not very realistic. So the membership will be after the war. But now the question was about invitation, formal procedure, which from my point of view, besides the fact that this is a formal procedure, but it had a lot of geopolitical meaning. And it would be a very clear geopolitical signal to Russian both political elite and ordinary people. I would call invitation to NATO is like long-range geopolitical missile, what was possible to have. Because really Russians need to have a very clear understanding from the West that Ukraine is gone from geopolitical point of view. Ukraine is on the Western side, and forget about all your nostalgies to imperial past and so on and so on. So and of course from simply from strategic point of view, sending a signal to Kremlin elite. Look, guys, all your stupid military efforts to fight against Ukraine, this is total nonsense. Ukraine really is becoming a member of NATO, and that's all. Unfortunately, that was not done. Why? We can just guess, what was the reason, especially that, as we understand, only two countries were expressing all that hesitation and resistance to extend an invitation. That was, Germany and United States. And of course, United States' position was crucial here. So what will be now, next again? I do not hear from President Biden, or in general from administration that they are denying Ukraine possibility to become a member of NATO after the war. It looks like that there is some kind of common agreement, but it was not written into communique, and this pity. And the question is, why not to give much more clear signal that really Ukraine is getting an invitation? Again, it's not clear. Still, I am hopeful that next year Washington summit, in April, will be a good occasion for both for President Biden and for the whole administration to make a different statement, and maybe that is what can be hopeful consequences of Vilnius summit.
I thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. You actually expressed what all optimists really think about, that this is the road from Vilnius to Washington. Hopefully, we will manage that this road would be successful both for Ukraine and the alliance. And now I turn to my good friend Arseniy Yatsenyuk, who calls himself a realist. So, Mr. Yatsenyuk, I'd like to ask you, our audience would like to hear your opinion. If you remember, in our policy paper, which was presented at the Kyiv Security Forum in May this year, what we wrote that for years, the main obstacle on Ukraine's progress toward the NATO membership was a lack of political will. Nothing may substitute Ukraine's NATO membership now. Ukraine should be invited to join NATO without delay. Don't you find that the story of what we saw in Vilnius is somehow, is a lack of political will? What's your take? You're welcome.
Well, this is the language, Danylo, we deliberated with you and the team before the Kyiv Security Forum and before we actually unfolded the paper on NATO. And as a chairman of Kyiv Security Forum, I am very grateful to Ambassador Herbst, to Ambassador Volker, to Prime Minister Kubilius, for their staunch, unwavering, and strong support of NATO aspirations of the Ukrainian people. We are on the same page. And the job you've done for the Ukrainian people is amazing. As a Ukrainian, whether I am happy or disenchanted, well, frankly speaking, as a Ukrainian, I am more disenchanted. As a former prime minister, you know, frankly, I didn't have exaggerated expectations. That's what I, as a quite realistic guy, expected. What we have missed, I mean, we as the free world, we as those who are fighting for freedoms and democracy and sovereignty and for the global order in this crazy world, we missed a historic momentum to restore the global order, to make Ukraine a NATO member, to show to all autocrats, dictators, and Nazi-style rulers like Putin that they will be brought to justice. And the NATO is the strongest political and military alliance in the world. And all these talks about NATO is obsolete or dead brain and the rest of the stuff, they will never reemerge. So at this particular juncture, we missed a historic moment. But again, is it the drama? Is it the entire collapse of the future of Ukraine NATO membership? No. And I want to be very clear. We got real tangible deliverables. As a co-sponsor of a very famous letter that I, as a Speaker of the House and then President and Prime Minister, submitted to NATO in 2008 before the Bucharest summit asking for map, I commend the decision of NATO member states to skip the map and actually to provide a one-step formula for Ukraine to join the NATO. The second issue, as of now, this is of crucial importance to provide everything that is needed for Ukraine to win this war. Yes, once again, I would be happy to see Ukraine as a NATO member state as quick as possible. But what, Danylo, you said, this is the lack of political will. And I do understand a number of calculations in different capitals, starting with the DC and West Wing and ending with the Chancellor, and not only. And look, even at Turkey, what happened with Sweden and the reluctance of Turkey to support Sweden accession. So it's all about the unity. But in order to get the real tangible result in DC, in Washington next year, Ukraine needs to prevail. And for this particular reason, what am I focused right now on? I am focused on security assistance guarantees. Because when some folks say that, look, we are to get security guarantees is Article 5. That's the only security guarantee I buy. All of the rest is security assistance guarantee. So we will get Article 5 after Ukraine becomes a full-fledged member of NATO. But as of now, we need a full-fledged, long-run financial military support for Ukraine to prevail in this bloody war. And this is the best response, and this is the best answer to Putin and to similar dictators like Putin. So my take is that as follows. Ukraine is to become the NATO member state in the nearest future. Ukraine will do its job in terms of reform agenda. The alliance is to show a very strong political unity and political willingness to make Ukraine as a NATO member state. It is in the interest of the alliance, and it is in the interest of Ukraine and the entire free world. The alliance and our Western friends and partners have to do their utmost to help Ukraine to prevail in this war. And for this particular issue, we need financial, economic, and military support, unlimited, for as long as it takes for Ukraine to win in this war.
Thank you, Arseniy. Ambassador Volker, and now I continue with my further questions to you. Mr. Yatsenyuk, actually, he described very serious accomplishments of this NATO summit. And responsibly speaking, we should never forget that there is a lot of actions and important decisions taken behind those steps and decisions that were taken today and yesterday. But nevertheless, in your opinion, as you are a student of the Russian mentality, if I may, in your opinion, what do you think, how Russia will read the results of NATO summit? Do you think, would they believe that NATO is hesitant about Ukraine? You're welcome.
Yes, thanks, Danylo. In short, yes, that is exactly how Russia will read it. I agree with Arseniy that, and I mentioned these steps, the decisions that were made, the removal of the map, for example, the elevation of the NATO-Ukraine Commission to a council, some of the efforts to help Ukraine become more interoperable. These are good things. These are positive steps, and they do reflect goodwill. But taken from the perspective of Putin, I think what he saw is hesitation. He saw a lack of resolve to actually do what Arseniy said, which is to secure the future of the free world beginning today. We are getting things back to the order where they belong. We didn't take that step. And I think Putin saw that. It reminds me, thinking about how Russia looks at things, it reminds me of the withdrawal from Afghanistan, where it was actually Ukrainian special forces who rescued the Wall Street Journal's journalistic team. They went out from the Kabul airport, grabbed the Wall Street Journal guys and brought them back when the US military was told not to do it. It's really striking, the hesitation that is apparent in that decision and in the decision now not to make a clear and unequivocal commitment to the future of Europe and future European security. Now, that being said, a point I wanted to come back to, and I wish I had said it earlier, but I want to repeat it, or I want to say it now, and it is consistent with what others have said here. This is not over. No one in Ukraine should look at this as a failure that will change the future. I believe that Ukraine's future is within NATO, as the communique says. I don't think there's anywhere else for Ukraine to go other than be fully a part of a democratic, prosperous, and secure Europe. That's the European Union as well as NATO. I think the US will come around on this. It's unfortunate that we didn't do it yesterday, but I think the US will. And I think all of us have to keep pushing for this because it is in all of our interest. The United States, Germany, Europe, NATO, Ukraine, it's in all of our interest to build that safe and prosperous future. So I do think we will get there. It was just a missed opportunity, as John said yesterday.
Thank you, Kurt. And thank you for all your support and for your strong, I would say, solidarity with Ukraine that we highly appreciate. Now I turn to John. John, I have two questions, if I may. First of all, you mentioned this, but I would like to kindly ask you to elaborate on this. How do you assess the tactics of President Zelensky during this summit? I just saw in the Financial Times that they quote the United Kingdom Defense Secretary Ben Wallace, who said today that we are not Amazon, that we can easily provide everything what Ukraine wants, and this is quite I would say quite a concerning message that or note that I noticed in this language that the United Kingdom Defense Secretary used. So my first question is, how do you assess the tactics? I mean, the performance of President Zelensky, was he convincing? what people think about his actions in Vilnius. And my second question is, what do you think? How the results of that of the NATO summit will influence the domestic political cuisine in Washington, D.C. Because a lot of people said that President Biden decided to keep on this track as he did during the summit because of some internal domestic reasons. So these are the two questions to you.
All right. Please repeat the first question.
The first one is, how do you assess the tactics of the Ukrainian delegation and President Zelensky himself?
All right. Look, Zelensky was and remains in a tough spot. There's no question that the Biden administration's policy since the big invasion, or even in the run-up to the big invasion, has been at least adequate to ensure that Moscow would not win in Ukraine. And we have provided massive amounts of assistance, military and economic, and have been at the center of efforts in the West to rally as many hands as possible to help Ukraine. And given how difficult this situation is, that's a real achievement. But I only call the Biden policy adequate because it has achieved this. What it has not done is stated the clear American stake in this war. We have a vital stake in Ukraine winning and Putin losing. It has not established that as a goal, Ukraine's victory or Russia's defeat, to explain to the American people why this is a smart way to defend American security rather than an extraordinary philanthropic effort to aid Ukraine. And associated with this is the unwillingness of the administration to send the more advanced weapons that would ensure a major Ukrainian success on the battlefield, and to anchor Ukraine in Europe through a much more robust program of NATO-Ukrainian cooperation now, with a clear timetable and stages for Ukraine's entry into NATO. And with this approach, they are risking eventual defeat if the West grows tired of supporting Ukraine. This is the problem. And this is well understood in Kyiv. So on the one hand, they have to continue pressing the United States to send more advanced weapons, because if they don't, they're less likely to receive those weapons. Zelensky has an influential voice in Washington and in Europe. At the same time, they have to avoid overly antagonizing the White House. I think Zelensky has done a pretty good job with this. His tweet that upset Biden was perhaps, again, a bit too strident, but on balance, it was necessary. And even had it been a slightly less strident, he still would have annoyed the White House. So he had to annoy the White House to advance Ukrainian interests, and I would argue also American interests, because Biden is not fully serving American interests. But Zelensky, understanding the dilemma, sent out a second tweet, much softer, as a gesture. And I think that both Biden and Zelensky now have an interest in downplaying the friction, but the friction is still there. Your second question now, about American domestic politics. There have been a lot of stories saying that one of the reasons, maybe the most important, but not necessarily the most important reason, for Biden's overly soft approach on NATO is that his political advisors, not his foreign policy advisors, his domestic policy advisors, those who are responsible for getting him reelected, are saying that this is the smart way to handle this conflict with our election coming up next year. I don't know if this is true. If it is, he needs to fire those advisors, because polls have demonstrated multiple times, including the very recent Ronald Reagan Institute poll, that a large majority of Americans, 70%, support stronger American aid to Ukraine and support Ukraine joining NATO. I believe that this is an historic opportunity for the United States, for President Biden, to show foreign policy mastery, by providing Ukraine all the support it needs to win faster on the battlefield and to anchor Ukraine firmly in Europe, in NATO, and the EU. But of course, the American voice on NATO is much larger than the voice on the EU. The fact that Biden has not grasped this opportunity, to me, is a serious error. That's the way for him to go into the election next year in a very strong position.
I do appreciate. John, great answer. Thank you very much. And now I turn to Prime Minister Kubilius. You know, I hate any kind of conspiracies and conspiracy theories that, you know, dance around every important political development. But nevertheless, I will name only one thing, but I'm doing this on purpose for making it never happen. You know, some people say, they suppose that the reason why there is no formal step forward Ukraine is that the question of Ukraine's membership in NATO may be some kind of trade thing for future talks with Russia. I mean, that's a dangerous scenario which will be never accepted by Ukraine, I believe, as the overall majority of Ukrainians stand strongly for Ukraine's membership in NATO. So, Mr. Prime Minister, what do you think about this context and about the most important priorities that Ukraine, together with our allies and true friends within the alliance, should implement within this year before and specifically for the upcoming upcoming NATO summit in Washington, D.C. So what are the priorities and what do you think about those kind of, you know, dangerous talks that are around around what we saw in Vilnius? You're welcome.
Yeah, you know, well, we are concerned, of course. You know, there are different rumors, and we are living, you know, as politicians, as human beings, in that field of rumors, you know, and we can just guess what can happen next. But definitely, one tendency which we are very much worried that Ukraine will start to be, you know, pushed into accept some kind of negotiations late in the autumn, and you know, and I don't know who will play what role, what will be the Washington position in such, you know, possible development. But I see the danger coming from a really lack of a broader strategy on the Western side, not only towards Ukraine, but to the broader region, including, you know, Belarus and Russia itself. You know, and without having in mind how much, you know, Ukrainian victory, Ukrainian membership in NATO, Ukrainian reconstruction and integration towards EU can influence in a positive way the whole region, including, you know, possible transformations in Russia. Without that, you know, really, then we are able to make some very big mistakes, including really pushing Ukraine for some kind of negotiations, you know, starting to negotiate with you know, Putin's Russia, because there is worries that Putin is becoming very weak. Prigozhin, Mutiny have shown that Putin is becoming very weak. You know, here is possibility of collapse of Russia, of chaos of Russia, you know, in Russia, of somebody like Prigozhin taking, you know, taking authority and you know, possibility to control nuclear weapons. And out from that, there is, you know, this idea, let's go for quick negotiations. I see really this would be a very big mistake, because it would allow simply Putin to rest a little bit, you know, and to come back with you know, with new aggression. What is needed really, very clear strategy how sustainable peace can be achieved on the European continent. And sustainable peace really demands big changes in Russia. And big changes in Russia can come only with Ukrainian victory and Ukrainian success. That is what I see, you know, what is needed, you know, to understand in the West. And Ukraine is doing great job, you know. If to remember, even, you know, even if to look into NATO and Ukraine relationship, if to remember why NATO was created back in 1949, the reason was very simple: how to stop, you know, Soviet Empire under Stalin, attempts to expand. And that was the reason why NATO was created. Now Ukraine is, defending not only itself, it defends the whole Europe against, Putin efforts to expand, to recreate empire and so on, and to expand its influence to the whole European continent. That is why not, we should, or whatever, demand from Ukraine to be grateful for our support. But, we need to be grateful to Ukraine, because Ukraine is doing NATO job without being member of NATO and without invitation even to become member of NATO. So this is what I see, lack of this, a little bit broader strategic views, both on what Ukraine is doing now and what, depends very much on the whole European continent, including eastern part of European continent, on Ukrainian success.
I thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. And now I turn to Arseniy Yatsenyuk, and I will ask him to sum up our conversation. And here I have just a final question. And even in our discussion, we mentioned this, that some critics may say that there is quite invisible difference between the language of Bucharest and Vilnius. But also someone may say that there is small difference between Budapest Memorandum and what the G7 countries suggest or suggested today in the context of a new type of security guarantees for Ukraine. You have already mentioned this, you have already talked about it, but I would kindly ask you to elaborate on this. Do you buy this formula? Do you think that this is the way how to ensure Ukraine's and European security? And what will be your final message to our audience, to Ukraine and to the international partners of summing up the results of NATO summit in Vilnius? You're welcome.
Well, to put it in a nutshell, I don't buy it, period. The only security guarantee which are realistic one and which can provide the real shelter and real security for Ukraine is Article 5 of Washington Treaty. All of the rest is security assistance guarantees, whatever. I've had a number of rumors about Israeli case or South Korean case and the rest of the stuff. But there are insurmountable differences, I would say. For example, in terms of Israel, they don't recognize that they possess nukes. But I've had some rumors that they do really possess nukes. Ukraine doesn't. And they don't have one of the biggest nuclear armed country on their borders. So my guess and my take is that the only real security guarantee for Ukraine is Article 5. In terms of our, I would say, joint perspectives. You've asked about the way how President Zelensky managed and charted this course. In my humble opinion, he did well on the international arena, and he deserves the credit. But I strongly believe that he has to deserve the credit in the domestic reform agenda, and that's what's desperately needed. In terms of President Biden, here is my guess. I believe that we will get more, much more, next year in DC at the next annual summit of NATO. And Ambassador Herbst is absolutely right. President Biden has to grasp this historic opportunity. And the United States is the leader of the free world. The US will lead the free world, as all this investment into the Ukrainian security, it's not a pure charity. Let's be frank. Due to Ukraine, Russia has been severely demilitarized by the Ukrainian military. And it's going to take from 3 to 10 years for Russian conventional forces to reimagine and to revamp. My take is that we are, Ambassador Herbst, Ambassador Volker, and Prime Minister Kubilius, and you, Danylo, and the entire, I would say, pro-NATO, pro-European, and pro-Ukrainian team has an enormous task in the forthcoming year. And the task is to get the tangible result during the next annual summit of NATO. In the meantime, it is of crucial importance to supply everything that is needed for Ukrainian military, for Ukrainian state, and for Ukrainian country to fend off Russian aggression and actually to liberate Ukrainian territory, to pave the way for long-lasting peace in Europe.
I do thank you. And I would like to thank gentlemen, all of you for your great remarks, for your important contribution to this conversation, and for your opinion, which is very important for the Ukrainian audience, as Ukrainians try to understand and to get a sober, critical, and pragmatic understanding of what happened in Vilnius. We understand that we continue our strong partnership and alliance with NATO. We move forward. We should not be disappointed as our people, our heroes on the front, continue their fight. And I would like to wish our men and women who fight with the enemy on the front every success, and to share with you my strong belief that Ukraine will prevail, Ukraine will become a NATO member, and we will manage to do it at Washington summit or on our way to full-fledged membership in the alliance. Once again, I thank you very much for this conversation, and look forward to seeing you at our future occasions. Thank you again.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.